Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to talk about sustainability and organic practices that can help you improve your health and perhaps pull you off the power grid just a little bit. On the program, we're joined by author of several books known as Kitchen Sink Gardening. It's a way that you can actually find ways that you can create your own gardening within your own home to create your own food to improve your health as well. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Jean-Pierre Parent. Jean,
good morning.
Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, these series of books, first of all, for the listeners out there, are a pretty easy read and pretty easy to follow, and they're not real preachy like you tend to find when it comes to the subject. Tell us how this all started for you.
Well, I've always been interested in feeling awesome, and from a young age, I did a lot of experimenting with different kinds of foods and always gravitated towards fresh, raw, vibrant foods. And I was kind of a weird kid. I went vegan at 9, and I gave up chocolate and soda that same year just in an effort to feel great. I remember actually I used to be a runner, and I had a McDonald's hamburger when I was like 8 years old. And then my mom took me she was running a marathon, I think, and I was doing like a 3-mile or whatever. And I felt so terrible. I was so excited for this hamburger because they had just built this McDonald's in my hometown, and everybody was super excited. And I felt so bad. And that was the first moment I made the connection between how I feel and what I eat. So from then on, it's just been getting better and better.
Now, it's pretty interesting because a lot of times, especially in the world when it comes to diet every year, that everybody seems to have an opinion about what's good for you and what's bad for you, what you should be doing, what you shouldn't be doing, and pretty soon it's a big confusing mess, isn't it?
Yeah, it's true, and it's great. It's important to stay curious. Our needs change as we age and as the seasons change, and, our emotional state changes, so it's really good to constantly, be learning and paying attention and not getting stuck in any one rut.
I think what's fascinating, I remember back, I think it was the early 90s, as I felt that kind of confusion. It was very frustrating to hear and see and view, and whatever the case may be when it came to diet, what the right thing to do was. So I just simply went to the library and breezed through more than 300 titles of books that had to do with the subject of diet and nutrition before I finally would find the ones that, to me, appealed in such a way that they said, this is common sense. Why don't you go ahead and read this and go from there? And I remember a fascinating book. It was called Diet and Nutrition, A Holistic Approach. And it was really fascinating to read this as it talked about food around the world, and things like that. And I thought, okay, now this is a lot better. And I started feeling a sense of empowerment as I began to take responsibility for this in my own hands. And then all of a sudden you're starting to see or listen to the programs on television or on radio, and you think, most of these people are full of BS. What are your thoughts about that as far as the diet industry goes?
Well, everybody's really trying to help, I think, and there's a lot of new research and a lot of conflicting information. And just like you said, if you go back to common sense, if you go back to what people have been doing for a long time, then I think you'll be okay.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said something that I think is very valuable for the listeners to understand, too. When it comes to diet, it really depends how do you feel after you consume whatever it is you consume, and that's really a great marker for people to begin to use. It's pretty interesting how that works.
Yeah, there's kind of two different ways to look at that. One is if you feel great after you eat, then that's a good sign. If you feel tired or lethargic or have any pain or anything like that, that's a bad sign. There's also, when people are transitioning to a better diet, there's sometimes, our bodies have adapted to this crappy food and our minds have made an emotional connection to it. So it can sometimes be kind of hard to separate how we actually feel and what's good for us in the long term versus sort of like what our craving and urges are in the short term. So I think that's where some information comes in, and all that research you did, that's super inspiring to me. I have to check out that book that you mentioned.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, like when I started eating more raw foods or only raw foods, I felt this, like it was a different kind of feeling in my body. I was used to consuming a lot of food. My stomach would distend. I would get a little tired, all the blood would go to my digestive system, and that was what nourishment was. So I started eating, more sprouts, more fresh stuff, and I would feel this incredible energy, but none of that heaviness in my belly. And so it took me a while, several months or even years, to get to the point of saying, okay, well, that's what nourishment is. It's all my cells being activated and energized instead of, eating empty food, having to fill up to try to avoid being hungry in 5 or 6 hours or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Now, the series of books that you wrote called Kitchen Sink Farming, tell us a little bit more about that, because for the listeners out there, this is something you can condense down to the point where even if you're living in a one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan, you can actually grow a sustainable garden with that kind of space.
Absolutely, and that's interestingly very close to how the books were conceived. I was living in a one-room apartment in Los Angeles, and I was a struggling writer. I was working in restaurants that kept going out of business, and so I just said, forget it. I'm just going to really simplify my life. I'm going to see how I can get by with less. And so, I'd been sprouting and fermenting and growing food most of my life, but I decided to really put it to the test and just focus on, how simple I could make it. So I started doing the sprouting, I started experimenting with different sorts of, what I could grow in containers. I had jars of stuff fermenting all over the place. And it was fun. It was really cheap. And I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, but I kind of, a secondary benefit was that I started to feel incredible, doing a lot of yoga at the time and just, a lot of meditating. And the food was just this final piece that just really made me feel great. And not only physically great, but it's so interesting how emotional and psychological wellness, even spiritual wellness, so much of it is biochemistry. Mm-hmm. So I started feeling great, and people would ask me what I was doing and ask me specific questions. Started writing emails, and then I said, okay, I've written the same email 10 times. Let me copy and paste it this next couple times. And then I thought, maybe I should codify this and put it in some kind of resource for people just to access without having to ask me the questions. And so that's when I started writing the books. It took about 8 years to finish the first 3. The 4th one, any day now, any week, it's going to be finished. And so then it'll be the complete set. The 5th one will be kind of a plagiarism of myself. That'll be a combination of the first 4, which was the original idea for the books. But it was my mom who said, JP, nobody wants to read a 700-page book about sprouting. Come on, break it up. So the first one is about sprouting. Second one about fermenting. Third one about growing food indoors, composting, worm culture, all that kind of thing. And then the 4th book is raw food recipes, what to do with all your sprouts and krauts and everything that you've made in the previous 3 books.
Mm-hmm. Now let's talk about what sprouting is. That's pretty much the first step that we go with here, and it kind of reminds me of, I remember being in, I guess, my first horticulture class in grade school, how you germinate a seed, get it to grow, that sort of a thing. And I think what's really fascinating about what you've produced here is it gets people back to basic learning and the fascination of where your food actually comes from.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, it's so much fun. It's super fun to do. It's super simple, and it just inspires a lot of curiosity and kind of awareness about the basic building blocks of life.
Now, there's a reason, there's a story that you share that I think would be really poignant for our listeners to hear about, and that's how Cuba became self-sustaining. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, just a little bit of my research showed this really interesting situation in Cuba's history where they were getting all of their resources from Russia. And in the early 90s, Soviet Union collapsed. Cuba found themselves completely cut off from all these resources, and they were kind of up the creek for a little bit. They were like 90% of their oil resources were coming straight from the Soviet Union, and they were the country in the area that was using the most. And so they had this whole economy, this whole society and way of life built on having access to all these resources. And so when they were cut off from that, there was a total shift in society. I don't remember exactly, but the average Cuban citizen lost like 20 pounds. The buses would would come 4 hours late or not at all, so people started riding bikes. They didn't have food. It was a pretty desperate time. And then they said, okay, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to give up, or are we going to figure this out? So they started going back to their grandparents and great-grandparents that remembered how to grow food and, how to know what to plant and different kinds of soil and all this kind of thing. And so they took all that traditional knowledge and they applied the ingenuity that comes from desperation. They started growing food everywhere, in every yard, in every, school playground, on roofs, on apartment terraces. And it took a while. I think it took several years, but they started really thriving. And interestingly, because they didn't have access to the petrochemicals, which a lot of chemical fertilizers and pesticides are based on, they had to use organic practices. They had to figure out companion planting. They had to figure out which bugs were going to help get rid of the pests that they didn't want. And so today I've heard that about 90% of the food that's grown in Cuba is organic, and the society has actually has gotten healthier than they ever have before. They have a higher life expectancy than most developed countries, and they actually they had 2 universities at the time of Soviet collapse, and currently they have about 50. They actually have so many professionals in healthcare and law and resource management that they export their professionals to other countries in South America and elsewhere in the world for free. So they have this abundance of health, of resources, of knowledge, all which came from kind of going back to the source and figuring out how to do it.
Yeah, it's easy for a lot of people to take a look at this, especially when it comes to food, and realize processed food, there's people that actually control the purse strings, that make the decisions about what we should be able to buy off the shelves, what we shouldn't be able to buy. But as you read the Kitchen Sink Farmer books, you begin to realize how empowered you can be. And I wanted you to use that example of Cuba because, here was a society that did that very thing. They not only adapted, but they began thriving. And there's the key element there that shows that you can pull away from all this corporate greed that we tend to like to bang the drums slowly about, and say, those people, they're evil, this and that and the other. But the thing is this is all about you empowering yourself and taking the necessary steps to step away from that kind of thing, and how possible this truly is. Now let's talk about what sprouting is, and and go into the health benefits, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So just like you said, and as you learned in school, sprouting is you take a seed and you germinate it, and all that means is that you make it think like it's going to turn into a plant. So this little seed is locked down. It can live in so many different environments for decades or even centuries and be totally cool until it's ready to sprout and become a plant. And the way that it thinks that it's going to become a plant is it has a little moisture, it's dark, it thinks it's under the ground, and it has the right temperature. It's not going to do it if it's super hot or super cold. And so what we do is, it sounds pretty complicated, everything I've said, but it's so simple. All we do is we soak it in water, and I use produce bags from the grocery store. Take these seeds that we're going to sprout, soak them in water overnight, and it's dark because it's in my kitchen. Pull it out, rinse it, and there it's ready to go. It thinks it's going to become a plant, so it activates all these enzymes, all these nutrients, because it's going to become this massive bush or tree or whatever it thinks it's going to do. And we give it the water that it needs a couple times a day just by rinsing it in the sink, getting rid of metabolic waste and hydrating it until we want to eat it, and we do. And it has just so much life force, so many nutrients, so much vitality. It has actually enzymes to spare. We can take them into our body, and there's this really incredible feature of enzymes, which is that we take them into our body. They're this catalyst for making change. The sprout has used them to make different biological processes, so it can go from being a seed to a sprout to a seedling to a big plant. We take it into our body, and we can kind of steal those enzymes and use them to help digest the food that we're eating. So a metabolic enzyme turns right into a digestive enzyme. But the cool thing is that if we have extra digestive enzymes, for example, it doesn't really take that much energy to digest a sprout, we have an abundance. So our body can turn those back into metabolic enzymes and use those for all the functions in our body to, repair damaged cells, to heal skin, to help us think better, to help us be more emotionally well. All from a little sprout. Pretty cool, huh?
Absolutely. And the other thing, too, is that it also helps to alkalize the body, and that's pretty important as well, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah. That's the result of just detoxing, which is something we use metabolic enzymes for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they say that disease can't originate in an alkaline system. It has to be an acidic system. So acidity is a buildup of toxins. There's some things that we eat, which we all know aren't good for us, which cause an acidic state. And so by just eating a handful of sprouts a day, we can really, take a lot of steps towards bringing our body back into balance.
Well, you can certainly imagine on Thanksgiving, which is today, what's really going on out there, huh?
Yeah, it is. That's why, people are all into going gung-ho raw food, which is cool if that's what's right for you at the time. But I really recommend everybody just add a handful of sprouts to every meal. It's going to go a really long way. It's really simple. They don't have to make any massive changes. And then as they become more alkaline, more balanced in their body, they're just going to naturally want to make healthier and healthier choices as the days and weeks and years go by.
What you say there, John, is very important for people to understand when it comes to change. And it's interesting how, especially in America, we want to change and we want to improve our lives. So we discover something that might help us to achieve this goal. And then we tend to want to overdo it. The attitude, more is better.
Yeah.
And therefore we end up falling short from our goal because it feels overwhelming and too hard. And the fact is, change can occur, but you have to do it subtly and enough to really feel the impact of the changes that you're making that inspires you to continue to where it becomes a habit.
Yep. The story that I sometimes tell about that is there's two cars next to each other, and both of them want to get on a different road. So one of the cars makes a big, turn with his wheel, and then he goes forward. The other car just makes a little 5% turn, and they go forward. And the first car will end up in the ditch. The second car, really very little change with the 5% turn, after just a little bit of driving. But then he drives a little more, and there's more change. It's pretty subtle, but, you can see it happening, and then more and more and more. And after several hours or days or weeks or years or whatever it is, that car is in a totally different place, just from a little 5% change. So if we make just one little change a day or a week, after months, after years, we're going to be in a totally different place, and it's going to be really easy and smooth. Whereas make a really big change at first, and just like you said, just like that first car, we might just end up in the ditch going nowhere.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that I like to do, especially to start off my day with breakfast, is that I like to make green and fruit smoothies. It's just something I enjoy doing. And again, as you talked about earlier in the program, how do you feel after you eat? And I remember one time being out to breakfast and having the typical breakfast that you tend to have when you go out. I just remember one day I thought, I've been doing this off and on for a while, and I just feel like going home and just taking a nap.
Yeah.
But I can't do this anymore. This just doesn't make sense. This isn't how you should feel after you eat. So I began doing the fruit smoothies, and it's amazing, as you were talking about feeling lighter, things digest easier. You seem to have energy because it's not spending all the time trying to break down what you just put into your body. And so then you began, or at least I began to find out how to make better smoothies, what to put in them nutritionally, so forth. And one of them was seeds, and I'd actually ground up flax seeds or sunflower seeds, whatever I'd get a hold of. And yet then I discovered, especially through the book, when you talk about sprouting, that the nutritional value of a seed is pretty good, but it becomes phenomenal once you sprout it. Now, talk about that a little bit.
Sure, yeah. Well, just, as I mentioned, what we're trying to do is kind of trick the seed into giving up its good stuff that it evolutionarily wants to use to become a plant, but we can activate it and take that into our bodies and utilize all that for what's important to us in our lives. As far as the breakfast thing goes, people feel they feel tired a lot of times because of the standard American breakfast. Part of that is what they're eating, but another part of that is the combination of the food. For example, starch and protein and sweet, like pancakes with bacon or whatever it is. We can only make one enzyme at a time to digest different foods. For example, we make lactose is an enzyme that we use to digest lactase, the milk protein. We make protease to digest proteins. Amylase we make to digest starches. And actually, I'm sorry, I think I switched the first two when I was talking about the milk. But so when we make them, our body has to decide, okay, which one am I going to make to digest this stuff? The other food will just kind of sit there, and it'll tire us out. And so when you're making fruit smoothies and with vegetables, one thing that you might want to try is skipping the fruit. Because if you're just making it with vegetables, and you can do some things like use some apple juice, which our body recognizes as vegetables. You can try some different things to make it taste good, a little bit of lemon, a little bit of mint, something like that. And it'll actually be even easier for your body to digest. And so that might be something that you want to try, down the road. Personally, I can't have anything with sugar right at the beginning of the day, because then it puts me on this metabolic roller coaster. So if I start with vegetables, which do have a little bit of sugar in them, but nowhere near as much as fruit, then it kind of puts me in this, it activates my metabolism, my digestion, and I can sail through the rest of the day with really even energy. And so the fruit thing in the morning, way better than what a lot of people are eating. And if that's, the step that somebody's on, that's fantastic. The goal is progress, not perfection, But as they continue to experiment, kind of a cool thing just to try vegetables first thing. And you can juice it, but since I'm super lazy, I just throw everything in my Vitamix with some water, turn it on, drink it. It takes me 30 seconds to make, 30 seconds to clean up, and I'm good to go for the day.
Well, you hit it right on the spot there, John. If everybody, they should have a Vitamix in their kitchen. I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I resisted it for about 10 years because I'm also extremely frugal. But I started using it like 3 or 4 times a day right at the beginning. It's my number one most important tool in my kitchen.
Mm-hmm. Because certainly, cooking food can also kind of remove some of the nutrition from it, but we won't get into that right now. Now back to sprouting. Now, what happens nutritional? I mean, the one thing I want you to talk about, too, is the nutritional value of a seed and how it changes as it sprouts.
Yeah, well, different nutrients will go up a lot based on, where the plant is in its life cycle. And there's tables and charts and all that stuff in the first book, Kitchen Sink Farming, Volume 1, which talks about that. But, this is kind of like information to occupy our mind. If we're sprouting the food, we know that it's going to be way more nutritious. And so, that's just what I do, and I feel great, and I move on with my day.
Now, where would a person take the first step to go and get seeds?
Well, if they're lucky enough to live in a town that has a co-op, there's probably alfalfa seeds, clover seeds, broccoli, red radish, that kind of thing at the co-op, maybe in the bulk bin. If they are lucky enough to have internet access, which is almost everybody in the world, they can just go online and order stuff. Look for organic sprouting seeds. They're on Amazon. There's a company called The Sprout House that has great stuff, and dozens of others. So they could just order them. A 4-ounce packet of sprouting seeds is probably going to be like $4 or $5, and that should last probably 2 or 3 weeks. So it's pretty low investment.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also talk about sustainability to the point where you can actually grow and get seeds, so this can become something that's continuous. And I know that we've heard stories about how Monsanto, in other words, to leverage the farmer, is giving them seeds that grow one plant one time and it's done, doesn't produce any more seeds. So obviously we want to stay away from that. But this is something that can be just continuous to where you can become very self-sustaining. And I think that's what makes the plant world so fascinating, is we live in symbiosis with it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've done that before with certain plants that produce a lot of seeds. For example, amaranth and quinoa. They're really easy to get the seeds off. You just shake the branch and they all come off, and you can save them all for sprouting. And then you have this plant when it finally, it's gone to seed, so it's probably on the end of its life cycle. Keep a couple of those seeds, throw them in another pot of dirt, water it, see if it comes up, and if it does, you can start the process all over again.
There you go, continuously recycling and creating your own food, and it becomes a very fascinating process, I'll bet. How I'm sure that you've had feedback from people that tell you that they probably never expected it to be so enjoyable, because when it comes to the word gardening, I think a lot of times people cringe because they feel like there's a lot of work involved there, but as you were saying earlier, your books were produced with the idea that you're essentially a lazy person.
Yeah. Yeah, and people always get on me for calling myself lazy. I do work like 80 hours a week, and then I do my extra projects after that. But you could possibly switch that word with efficient. And I just read a quote by Winston Churchill that said, not Winston Churchill. It was Bill Gates. He said, if you need something done quickly, give it to a lazy person, and they'll figure out the most efficient way. So that's me.
That's exactly how I feel, too.
Yeah,
I'm
great.
not lazy. I just like to find the quickest way to get something done so I can maybe not go do something else.
Yeah, exactly. Get on with your life.
Yeah. It was funny. I was just watching on OPB last night. They were talking about speed. And one of the segments on that was the UPS company, and showing how they have to map out on a particular driver's route the most efficient way to get packages delivered when they're supposed to be, when you can pick it up, and all this. And it was pretty amazing to take a look at that and realize that that's something that has to happen in a person's life. One of the things that they may think about when it comes to sprouting and growing their own food is, well, I just don't have time. But the fact is, when it comes to sprouting, as you describe in your book, and the process of even cultivating, that it really doesn't take a whole lot of time to do that. This pretty much does it on its own once you get it started. Yeah,
it's totally true. Just talking about UPS has got me really excited. I'm really into game theory right now and developing more strategic thinking. Very cool. But none of that has to be applied to sprouting. And I almost didn't want to write a big book about it. I just wanted to make a pamphlet so that I could list it in maybe 3 or 4 steps, so that it wasn't overwhelming for people. Once you do it, you understand how easy and fun and simple it is. But beforehand, it can seem like there's a bit of a learning curve. Really, just get some seeds, put them in a produce bag, soak them in water overnight, pull them out, rinse them a couple times a day until they're delicious, and then eat them. That's all there is to it. You can definitely fancy it up with different kinds of seeds, for different kind of tastes or nutrients. You could even, grow the seed into microgreens and lettuces and stuff like that. But really the basic thing, and this is what I do all the time, just soak them, rinse them, eat them.
There you go. And it sure is a lot of fun doing that as well, especially for people out there who have families, young children. This is, to me, a necessity. This is something you should be doing with them so that you can create and instill good habits when it comes to their health and their nutrition and so forth. And it's also just a lot of fun.
It's true, yeah. Very cool.
Now, for our listeners out there, John, can you give out a website where they can discover more?
Definitely. My website, yes, kitchensinkfarming.org is the website for my blog. Also, my fermented food and drink company, Simple Foods. That's sympleFoods.com. And there's connection to the Facebook stuff, the Instagram, and the blog stuff on that page as well.
Very good. Jean, thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Hopefully we'll have you back so we can talk about those other things. And again, one step at a time for people to put something new into what they're doing and you're going to have phenomenal end results over time. And I think that's exciting for people to know, especially when it comes to how simple it is.
Absolutely.
Thanks
for
being
so much
on the
for
program.
having me.
You betcha.
I'm happy to be back anytime. We'll talk about fermenting next.
Absolutely. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. I hope you're enjoying your Thanksgiving. Be sure to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. Also, subscribe to our free weekly e-news updates as well. You can follow us on Twitter at Beyond50Radio as well as Facebook. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 Radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.